Jiho was a man who ruled the soul underworld with a blade and a ledger, believing every soul had a breaking point. But when he ordered his enforcers to ground Seo's flower shop into the dirt to clear a path for his empire, he didn't realize he was destroying the only hands capable of saving his dying mother. He thought he was crushing a weak obstacle. He had no idea that while he was planning her ruin, she was secretly signing away her entire life's inheritance to pay for the $200 million surgery that would keep his mother alive. Jiho is at the height of his power, needing only one final district to complete a massive redevelopment project that will cement his legacy. Standing in his way is a small, fragrant shop that has refused to move for generations. Seiya, the owner, isn't moved by Jiho's threats or his blood-stained money. For her, the shop is a living connection to her mother, Hyun. After a final refusal, Jiho's patience snaps. In a calculated display of Mafia-style intimidation, his men, Minjun, Baekhyun, and the others, systematically dismantle the shop overnight. Jiho leaves the ruins feeling victorious, only to arrive at the hospital and find his mother's unpayable medical debt cleared by an anonymous benefactor. The story freezes when he discovers the paper trail leads to... The city of Seoul didn't just grow, it was carved out of concrete and sheer will by men like Jiho. At 34, he stood at the apex of a syndicate that functioned with the cold precision of a Swiss watch and the brutality of a winter gale. To the public, he was the shadow behind the glass towers rising over the Han River. To the underworld, he was the Iron Ruler, a man who believed that every person had a price and every obstacle was merely a temporary delay in his inevitable progress. His reputation was built on a decade of silence, the kind of silence that followed a business rival's disappearance or the shuttering of a neighborhood that stood in the way of his blueprints. Jiho's current obsession was the redevelopment of the Central District, a billion-dollar project designed to cement his family's legacy. He had systematically acquired every deed, silenced every protest, and bought out every landlord across 12 city blocks. Every contract had been signed, and every owner had folded under the weight of his negotiations, except for one. Seiya's flower shop, a small, weathered building wedged between two shimmering skyscrapers, was the single jagged tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. It was a place of soft colors and organic scents that seemed to repel the sterile, metallic air of Jiho's world. He had sent Minjun with a generous offer, then Baekhyun with a threat, and finally a legal team with a mountain of paperwork. Each time, the result was the same, a polite refusal. Standing in his high-rise office, Jiho looked down at the tiny plot of land. To him, it wasn't a business, it was a malfunction in his machine. He didn't understand why someone would choose a handful of wilting stems over a fortune that could last 10 lifetimes. His flaw was a total inability to calculate the value of things that couldn't be deposited in a bank. Legacy, memory, and the scent of a mother's favorite bloom. "It's just a shop, Jiho," Minjun said, standing by the door. "One woman, one signature." Jiho adjusted his cufflink, his eyes cold and fixed on the street below. "The project moves forward on schedule. If she won't take the money, she'll take the consequences. Strength isn't about asking, it's about ensuring there is no other option." He didn't care about the history buried in those floorboards, he only cared about the footprint of his towers. As he grabbed his coat to leave, the Iron Ruler had already decided that by sunrise, the only thing left of the shop would be the smell of crushed earth. He had no way of knowing that the very woman he was about to break was currently the only person in the world keeping his mother's heart beating. The silence of midnight in the Central District was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, expectant hush that preceded a storm. Seah stood in the deep shadows of the alleyway across from her shop, her breath hitching as the sleek black sedans pulled to a curb with synchronized precision. She recognized the lead car, the one that carried the man who viewed her heritage as a mere line item on a balance sheet. Min-jun was the first to step out, his silhouette sharp and predatory against the streetlights. Behind him, the entourage of men in matching dark suits moved with a chilling, robotic efficiency. They didn't carry sledgehammers or chains. They carried the cold authority of those who knew they were above the law. With a single nod from Min-jun, the glass front of the shop shattered, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the empty street. From her hiding place, Seah watched as the world she had carefully tended began to dissolve. She saw the flash of steel as display racks were toppled. She heard the sickening crunch of ceramic pots, the ones her mother, Hayun, had painted by hand, hitting the floor. A row of glass vases followed, spilling water across the tile like a cold, rising tide that soaked into the petals of freshly cut lilies. She wanted to scream, to run out and shield the delicate blooms with her own body, but a profound, heavy resignation anchored her to the shadows. It was the same quiet strength she had seen in her mother, a peace made with loss a long time ago. Tears tracked silently down her cheeks, hot and biting, as she watched the Mafia-style enforcement team systematically dismantle 40 years of history in under 10 minutes. Min-jun stood in the center of the wreckage, his boots crushing a fallen red rose into the dirt-stained floor. He didn't look angry. He looked bored, as if he were merely filing a report. He adjusted his jacket and signaled for the men to retreat. As the engines roared back to life and the sedans disappeared into the neon glow of the city, the only sound left was the drip of water from a broken shelf. Seah stepped out into the light, her feet crunching on the glass that used to be her windows. She knelt in the center of the ruin, not to wail, but to begin the methodical task of picking up the stems, one by one. In the wreckage, she found a small, mud-caked slip of paper, a medical record she had been carrying for weeks. She pressed it against her chest, her eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the hospital where a woman she had never met was fighting for her life. The iron ruler had taken her shop, but he could not take the secret she was carrying, a sacrifice that was already in motion. The sterile chill of the hospital's private wing was a sharp contrast to the humid, glass-strewn heat of the ruins Jiho had left behind. He walked the corridor with the same measured stride that commanded boardrooms and back alleys, yet each step felt increasingly hollow. For a man who had spent his life accumulating the kind of power that could move mountains and silence cities, the heavy silence of the intensive care unit was a taunt. Through the observation window, he watched his mother, her form frail and nearly lost amidst the tangle of tubes and the rhythmic, mechanical wheezing of the ventilator. She was the only person who had ever seen the boy behind the iron ruler, and now she was fading. The disease was a relentless adversary, one that didn't care about his lineage or his syndicate's reach. His doctors had been clinical and blunt. She needed a highly specialized experimental surgery involving a rare biological compatibility that few possessed. The cost was a staggering $200 million, a sum that was as much a testament to the procedure's complexity as it was to its exclusivity. Jiho had the money. He had bags of cash, offshore accounts, and liquid assets that could fund a small war. But in the world of high-stakes medicine, money was merely the entry fee. The miracle itself was not for sale. The ticking clock wasn't just a metaphor. It was the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor that signaled another second lost. He had scoured the globe for a match, his desperation manifesting as a cold, quiet fury that terrified his subordinates. He was a man who could buy anything, yet he stood there realizing he couldn't buy a single day of extra life for the woman who had given him everything. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass, his breath fogging the surface. For the first time, the weight of his empire felt like an anchor rather than a throne. He thought of the $200 million as a meaningless number, a pile of paper that couldn't mend a single cell. He was prepared to burn the city down if it would provide a cure, yet he was forced to wait for a ghost, an anonymous donor who hadn't yet appeared. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a message from Hajun about the district clearing, but he didn't check it. The calculated ruin he had orchestrated earlier that night felt distant and insignificant compared to the fragility of the pulse on the screen. He was a king in a world of shadows, realizing that all his gold couldn't light the darkness currently swallowing his mother. He was desperate, not for land or power, but for a miracle that remained stubbornly out of reach, unaware that the miracle had already been signed for in a ruined shop blocks away. The following morning, the hospital corridor felt narrower, the air thick with the metallic tang of antiseptic and the low hum of life support machinery. Jiho walked toward his mother's room with a heavy, uncharacteristic weight in his chest. He had spent the night in a fever of logistical planning, ready to move heaven and earth, or dismantled the city's financial district, to secure the $200 million for the experimental procedure. He was a man who understood the world through the lens of force and acquisition, and he had come prepared to pay the entry fee for a miracle with blood-stained capital. He was intercepted near the nurses' station by a senior administrator, a man who usually flinched at Jiho's approach. This time, the administrator held a single embossed folder with an expression of bafflement. "Mr. Jiho," the man stammered, "there has been a development regarding your mother's account." Jiho didn't stop moving. "If the specialists are demanding an advance, tell them it's being wired. I don't care about the terms." "No, sir, that's just it," the administrator said, hurried footsteps echoing to keep pace. "The entire surgical fee, the full $200 million, was settled an hour ago. The payment was cleared through a private estate endowment. It's been paid in full." Jiho came to a dead halt. The freeze was a physical one, a sudden lock in his joints that left him paralyzed in the center of the sterile hallway. He was a man who had built a career on being the most decisive person in every room, someone who never owed explanations and certainly never owed debts he hadn't negotiated himself. The shock hit him like a physical blow. In his world, money of this magnitude was a weapon or a cage. Nobody gave it away without a demand. "Who?" Jiho's voice was low, vibrating with a dangerous edge of confusion. "The donor requested strict anonymity, sir," the administrator replied, handing him a digital receipt. "They cited a generational obligation. The funds were transferred from a dormant trust linked to a small property in the central district." Jiho stared at the digital screen, his mind stopping its forward motion, his eyes fixed on the timestamp. The payment had been authorized at 3 a.m., only hours after he had watched his men systematically crush the life out of a small flower shop. The guilt arrived slowly at first, then all at once. He leaned against the cool white wall, the receipt trembling slightly in his hand. He had spent the night trying to destroy the woman who, in the very same hours, had been quietly signing away her entire legacy to save the only person he loved. For the first time in his life, the Iron Ruler felt the crushing weight of a debt he could never pay back with force. The digital receipt in Jiho's hand felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried, a cold weight that seemed to drain the color from the sterile hospital walls. He didn't believe in coincidences, and he certainly didn't believe in miracles that arrived without a hidden price tag. He needed to know whose hand had reached into his world to settle a debt of $200 million. With a face like carved granite, he stepped away from his mother's bedside and placed a call that would bypass every legal firewall in the city. Un Wu, the syndicate's most clinical data specialist, answered on the first ring. Jiho didn't offer a greeting. "I'm sending you a transaction ID from the hospital's endowment fund," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. I want the source. I want the name of the individual who authorized the transfer, the estate it was drawn from, and the history of every yuan in that account. I want it now." The wait was a torturous stretch of silence, marked only by the distant rhythmic beep of medical monitors. Jiho paced the narrow confines of the waiting room, his mind racing through a list of potential allies and rivals. He considered international conglomerates, old family friends, even enemies looking to put him in a perpetual state of gratitude. None of the math added up. 20 minutes later, his phone buzzed. It was a single encrypted file. Jiho opened it, his eyes scanning past the banking codes and the legal jargon of the private estate trust. He looked for a corporate logo or a high-profile name. Instead, his gaze snagged on a name that made the air vanish from his lungs. Saya. The investigation trail was undeniable. The funds had been liquidated from a dormant family inheritance, a dowry and landholding that had been passed down through generations, intended to be Saya's safety net for life. It was the very same estate that had granted her the deed to the flower shop he had ordered crushed only hours before. Jiho felt a sudden, violent shift in his equilibrium. He leaned against the glass observation window, staring at the name on the screen as if it were a ghost. The anonymous angel who had sacrificed her entire future to keep his mother's heart beating was the same woman he had tried to break with a Mafia-style raid. The irony was a jagged blade, twisting in his gut. He had spent the better part of a decade believing that strength was found in the ability to take. In a single moment of digital clarity, he realized he had been humbled by a woman whose only power was the ability to give. He closed his eyes. The image of Saya kneeling in the ruins of her shop burned into his retinas, realization dawning that he had declared war on the only person who had ever truly shown him mercy. The morning sun was a cruel observer, casting long, sharp shadows over the wreckage of the central district. Jiho arrived at the shop not in a motorcade, but on foot, his presence stripped of the loud, kinetic energy that usually preceded the Iron Ruler. He stood at the edge of the shattered storefront, a silent ghost in a dark suit, watching the woman he had tried to erase. The air still carried the faint, dying sweetness of crushed lilies and the damp smell of spilled earth, a scent that now felt like a physical weight against his chest. Inside the ruins, Saya was kneeling. She didn't look up when his shadow fell across the threshold. Her methodical attention was focused entirely on the floor, her hands moving with a grace that felt defiant amidst the chaos. She was gathering the broken stems of red roses, her fingers occasionally snagging on the thorns he had forced her to handle. There was no anger in her movements, only a quiet, bone-deep weariness that unnerved Jiho more than any scream of rage ever could. He watched her pick up a ceramic shard, a piece of a pot that likely held the white gardenias his arm had swept away the night before. As she placed it into a small pile, a bead of blood bloomed on her thumb from a fresh cut. She didn't flinch. She simply wiped it away on her apron and reached for the next stem. To Jiho, this shop had been a malfunction in his machine, a tiny parcel of land wedged between aging brick buildings that simply refused to move. Now, seeing her in the center of the destruction, he realized it wasn't a business she was clinging to, it was a sanctuary of memory that he had treated as a transaction. He wanted to speak, to offer the apology he had practiced in the sterile silence of the hospital, but the words felt thin and poorly made. How could he explain that he knew her secret? How could he tell the woman who had anonymously saved his mother's life that he was the one who had systematically destroyed her own? He remained in the doorway, a predator paralyzed by the mercy of his prey. He saw the dark eyes and the calm expression that had haunted his thoughts all night, realizing that while he had reshaped the city's skyline, he had failed to understand the strength of a single wooden door propped open to the morning air. He stood there, the most powerful man in the city, feeling smaller than the smallest stem rolling slowly across the wet tile. Jiho finally stepped over the threshold, the crunch of glass beneath his leather shoes sounding like a confession. Saya didn't stop her work, her back still turned to him as she swept a pile of ruined petals into a dustpan. The air was thick with the scent of dying jasmine and the heavy, unspoken weight of the night before. "I know," Jiho said, his voice stripped of its usual sharp authority. It was a low, jagged sound that seemed to vibrate in the small space.
Saya paused, her shoulders stiffening slightly, but she did not turn around. "You know many things, Jiho. You know how to clear a district. You know how to break a door." "I know about the $200 million, he countered, stepping closer until he was standing amidst the overturned pots. "I know it was you. I know you liquidated your family's entire estate to pay for a surgery for a woman you've never met. My mother." Now she turned. Her eyes were rimmed with red from lack of sleep, but her gaze was as steady as a mountain lake. She didn't look like a victim, and she didn't look like a hero. She simply looked like someone who had done what was necessary. "I didn't do it for you," she said quietly. Jiho reached into his coat and pulled out a thick black envelope. "In here is a draft for 2 billion won. It is 10 times what you paid. It will rebuild the shop in marble. It will buy you 10 more shops just like it. It's a start, a small part of the debt I owe you." Sayal looked at the envelope, then back at his face. For a moment, the Iron Ruler expected her to take it, to demand more, or to rail against him. Instead, a small, sad smile touched her lips. She reached out, but did not take the money. She gently pushed his hand back toward his chest. "I don't want your money, Jiho." "It's not charity," he snapped, his old temper flickering as he struggled with the unfamiliar feeling of helplessness. "It's a transaction. You saved her life. I am paying for that service." "That's your problem," Saya said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You think everything is a transaction. You think mercy has a price tag. If I take that money, then what I did becomes a business deal. It becomes as cold and as hollow as your skyscrapers." She looked around at the wreckage of her grandmother's legacy. "What you destroyed here was priceless. You can't fix it with a checkbook. I saved her because she needed saving. Keep your blood money. I just want you to leave this place alone." Jiho stood frozen, the envelope feeling like a lead weight in his hand. For the first time in his life, he realized there was a level of power he couldn't touch, a dignity that his billions couldn't buy and his men couldn't break. He had offered her a fortune, but she had left him with something far more expensive, the crushing weight of a debt of honor that he had no way to settle. The glass-walled boardroom atop the syndicate's headquarters felt more like a battlefield than a place of business. Jiho sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his expression unreadable, while the men who helped him build his empire, the board of high-ranking lieutenants and invested rival bosses, fumed with growing impatience. Outside the window, the city skyline he had promised to reshape stood as a reminder of the billions currently hanging in the balance. "The demolition crew was turned away this morning, Jiho," Sawajun said, his voice tight with frustration that bordered on insubordination. "They were told the orders came directly from you. The Central District project is at a standstill because of a few square meters of dirt and a wooden door that should have been toothpicks by dawn." "The investors are asking questions," Baekhyun added, leaning forward, his eyes scanning Jiho for any sign of the softness that was rumored to be spreading. "Every hour that shop stands, it costs us more than that entire block is worth. The other bosses think you've lost your nerve. They think the Iron Ruler has finally rusted." Jiho didn't flinch. He adjusted his cufflink with the same methodical calm he had shown while watching Sawa pick up the thorns of her ruined roses. In his world, showing weakness was a death sentence, but he realized now that there was a difference between power and brutality. He had spent years breaking obstacles, but for the first time, he was being asked to destroy a debt of honor that he couldn't even put into words.
The footprint of the development is being revised, Jiho said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that silenced the room. The Bennett Blooms parcel is no longer part of the acquisition. The towers will be redesigned to curve around the shop. The courtyard layout will be reworked to ensure foot traffic passes her entrance. A heavy, stunned silence followed. To these men, Jiho's words were heresy. He was proposing to weaken a billion-dollar masterpiece for the sake of a weathered shop. "What did she give you that's worth this much?" one of the rival bosses sneered. Jiho stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the blueprints spread across the table. He didn't tell them about the $200 million surgery. He didn't tell them about the silent donor file or the woman kneeling in the ruins. To them, it was an obstacle. To him, it was now a sanctuary.
"It's already decided," Jiho stated, his gaze narrowing as it swept the room, daring any of them to challenge him. "If any of you, or your men, so much as breathes near that shop again, you won't just be dealing with a florist, you'll be dealing with me. The project moves forward, but we build around the things we cannot replace." He walked out of the room, leaving his lieutenants in a state of shock. He was no longer just building a plaza, he was fighting an internal war to protect the only person who had ever shown him that some things are truly priceless. The morning of the surgery had been a blur of high-stakes precision, but the recovery wing was settled in a profound, heavy silence. Jiho sat by his mother's bed, the steady, rhythmic pulse on the monitor no longer a ticking clock of dread, but a song of survival. His mother, her eyes fluttering open for the first time in days, looked at him with a clarity that seemed to pierce through his hardened exterior. When she was strong enough to speak, she didn't ask about the syndicate or the project. Instead, her gaze drifted to the small bouquet of wild lavender and sprigs of eucalyptus Jiho had placed on her bedside table, flowers he had personally retrieved from the only shop left standing in the central district. Beside the vase sat a framed, weathered photograph he had found in the shop's debris and kept to return to Sia. It showed a younger Lily Bennett, or Sia, standing beside a woman with a radiant, kind smile. "Hayun," his mother whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. Jiho leaned forward, his heart skipping a beat. "You know her, mother?" His mother reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the glass of the frame. Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes as she began to speak of a soul that existed before the skyscrapers and the neon. Decades ago, when Jiho was just a child, and his father had died leaving them with nothing but debt and hunger, she had collapsed on a frozen sidewalk from exhaustion. It was Hayun, the owner of a small, struggling flower shop, who had found her. "She brought us inside," her mother remembered, her voice gaining a ghost of its former strength. "She fed us, sat with me through the fever, and refused every attempt I made to pay her back once we found our footing. When I left her shop that day, she pressed a single rose in my hand and told me that kindness always comes back around." Jiho felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. He looked at the woman in the photograph, the mother of the woman he had tried to ruin. He realized then that Sia hadn't saved his mother out of a sense of business or even random charity. She had recognized the name on the medical file. She was completing a circle that had been drawn before Jiho was even old enough to understand the world. The secret was out, a decades-old legacy of mercy that turned his entire world upside down. He had spent his life believing that power was built on what you could take by force, yet his very existence was the result of a woman who chose to give. He looked at his mother, then at the photograph of Hayun, finally understanding that the smallest building in his empire was actually its most vital foundation. The legacy of Hayun wasn't just a shop, it was the reason he was still a son. The grand opening of the Central District development was a day of stark architectural triumph, but the man who had envisioned it stood with his back to the towering glass spires. Jiho watched from the edge of the new limestone courtyard as the autumn sun caught the copper accents of the redesigned plaza.
Journalists and investors moved through the space, their conversations filled with praise for the unusual and quietly interesting design choice that had become the project's signature. In the very center of the billion-dollar concrete empire, surrounded by the high-end retail and premium residential units of Jiho's vision, stood a small building with a weathered wooden door. It looked like something that had simply refused to move, and for the first time, Jiho saw it not as a flaw, but as the heart of the entire district. The architects had been forced to curve the towering skyscrapers around the shop, creating a natural flow of foot traffic that led every visitor directly past the window boxes, overflowing with seasonal color. Inside the shop, the smell was overwhelming in the best way, green and sweet and alive. Seo was busy helping a line of customers that stretched out into the courtyard, her movements steady and full of the calm Jiho had once found so unnerving. He watched her from a distance, the iron ruler now acting as a silent guardian. He had ensured that no debt collectors, no rival enforcers, and no predatory developers would ever cross that threshold again. He had built a fortress of steel to protect a sanctuary of petals. His mother, Margaret, walked slowly on his arm. Her strength returned, but her pace unhurried. She stepped into the shop, and for a moment, time seemed to fold back on itself. She placed a small bouquet on the counter, a return of the gesture Hyun had made decades ago. Seiya looked up, her gaze meeting Jiho's through the window. There was no longer a contract between them, no blood money and no threats. There was only the quiet acknowledgement of a debt that could never be settled, only honored. As the evening lights of the plaza flickered to life, the towers cast long shadows, but the light stayed longest on the small hand-painted sign of the flower shop. Jiho realized that while he had spent years trying to dominate the city, he had only truly succeeded when he learned to build around the things that were priceless. Outside, the fountains ran perfectly, and the restaurants were full. But in the center of it all, flowers continued to bloom, a reminder that kindness has a longer memory than power, and that even in an empire of concrete, the softest things are the ones that endure. Moral lesson. The story of Jiho and Seiya offers several profound moral lessons centered on the complexity of human character and the enduring power of quiet virtues. The circular nature of kindness. The narrative illustrates that kindness always comes back around. The life-saving surgery Seiya provided was not a random act, but the harvest of a seed planted by her mother decades earlier. It teaches that good deeds create a legacy that protects future generations in ways we may never witness. Dignity over wealth. Seiya's refusal of the blood money demonstrates that integrity cannot be bought. By rejecting the 2 billion won, she preserved the sanctity of her sacrifice, proving that some actions lose their value the moment they are turned into a transaction. The limits of material power. Jiho, the iron ruler, learns that despite his billions, he was powerless against his mother's illness. This highlights the truth that the most essential things in life, health, love, and genuine mercy, operate outside the laws of the marketplace and cannot be controlled by force. True strength is found in restraint. While Jiho initially defined strength as the ability to crush obstacles, his ultimate growth is shown through restraint, choosing to redesign an entire billion-dollar project to protect a tiny shop shows a higher form of power, the strength to honor a debt of heart over a margin of profit. The danger of dehumanizing others. The calculated ruin occurred because Jiho viewed Seiya's shop as a malfunction rather than a human legacy. The story serves as a reminder that behind every obstacle is a human story, and treating people as mere line items often leads to destroying the very things we might one day need.